The Mohan Man-Eater. Chapter 1. 15 miles from our summer home in the Himalayas, there is a long ridge running east and west, some 9,000 feet in height. On the upper slopes of the eastern end of this ridge, there is a luxuriant growth of oat grass. Below this grass the hill falls steeply away in a series of rock cliffs to the Kosi River below. One day a party of women and girls from the village on the north face of the ridge were cutting the oat grass, when a tiger suddenly appeared in their midst. In the stampede that followed, an elderly woman lost her footing, rolled down the steep slope, and disappeared over the cliff. The tiger, evidently alarmed by the screams of the women, vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared, and when the women had reassembled and recovered from their fright, they went down the grassy slope and, looking over the cliff, saw their companion lying on a narrow ledge some distance below them. The woman said she was badly injured. It was found later that she had broken a leg and fractured several ribs and that she could not move. Ways and means of a rescue were discussed, and it was finally decided that it was a job for men, and as no one appeared to be willing to remain at the spot, they informed the injured woman that they were going back to the village for help. The woman begged not to be left alone, however, and at her entreaty a girl, 16 years of age, volunteered to stay with her. So, while the rest of the party set off for the village, the girl made her way down to the right, where a rift in the cliff enabled her to get a foothold on the ledge. This ledge only extended halfway across the face of the cliff and ended, a few yards from where the woman was lying, in a shallow depression. Fearing that she might fall off the ledge and be killed on the rocks hundreds of feet below, the woman asked the girl to move her to this depression, and this difficult and dangerous feat the girl successfully accomplished. There was only room for one in the depression, so that the girl squatted, as only an Indian can squat, on the ledge facing the woman. The village was 4 miles away, and once again, the two on the ledge speculated as to the length of time it would take their companions to get back to the village, what men they were likely to find in the village at that time of day, how long it would take to explain what had happened, and finally, how long it would take the rescue party to arrive. Conversation had been carried on in whispers for fear the tiger might be lurking in the vicinity and hear them, and then, suddenly, the woman gave a gasp and the girl, seeing the look of horror on her face and the direction in which she was looking, turned her head and over her shoulder saw the tiger, stepping out of the rift in the cliff onto the ledge. Few of us, I imagine, have escaped that worst of all nightmares in which, while our limbs and vocal cords are paralyzed with fear, some terrible beast in monstrous form approaches to destroy us. The nightmare from which, sweating fear in every pore, we waken with a cry of thankfulness to heaven that it was only a dream. There was no such happy awakening from the nightmare of that unfortunate girl, and little imagination is needed to picture the scene. A rock cliff with a narrow ledge running partly across it and ending in a little depression in which an injured woman is lying, a young girl frozen with terror squatting on the ledge, and a tiger slowly creeping towards her, retreat in every direction cut off, and no help at hand. Mohan Singh, an old friend of mine, was in the village visiting a sick daughter when the women arrived, and he headed the rescue party. When this party went down the grassy slope and looked over the cliff, they saw the woman lying in a swoon, and on the ledge they saw splashes of blood. The injured woman was carried back to the village, and when she had been revived and had told her story, Mohan Singh set out on his 18-mile walk to me. He was an old man well over 60, but he scouted the suggestion that he was tired and needed a rest, so we set off together to make investigations. But there was nothing that I could do, for 24 hours had elapsed and all that the tiger had left of the brave young girl, who had volunteered to stay with her injured companion, were a few bits of bone and her torn and blood-stained clothes. This was the first human being killed by the tiger, which later received recognition in government records as the Mohan Man-Eater. After killing the girl, the tiger went down the Kosi Valley for the winter, killing on its way, among other people, 2 men of the Public Works Department, and the daughter-in-law of our member of the Legislative Council. As summer approached, it returned to the scene of its first kill, and for several years thereafter its beat extended up and down the Kosi Valley from Kakragit to Gargya, a distance of roughly 40 miles, until it finally took up its quarters on the hill above Mohan, in the vicinity of a village called Kartkanola. At the district conference, to which reference has been made in a previous story, the 3 man-eating tigers operating at that time in the Kumaon division were classed as follows in their order of importance. First, Chowgar, Nainital district. Second, Mohan, Almora district. Third, Kanda, Garhwal district. After the Chowgar tiger had been accounted for, I was reminded by Baines, Deputy Commissioner, Almora, that only a part of my promise made at the conference had been fulfilled, and that the Mohan tiger was next on the list. The tiger, he stated, was becoming more active and a greater menace every day, and had during the previous week killed 3 human beings, residents of Kartkanala village. It was to this village Baines now suggested I should go. While I had been engaged with the Chowgar tiger, Baines had persuaded some sportsmen to go to Kartkanala, but though they had sat up over human and animal kills, they had failed to make contact with the man-eater and had returned to their depot at Ranakhet. Baines informed me I should now have the ground to myself, a very necessary precaution, for nerves wear thin when hunting man-eaters, and accidents are apt to result when 2 or more parties are hunting the same animal. Chapter 2. It was on a blistering hot day in May that I, my 2 servants, and the 6 Garhwalis I had brought with me from Nainital alighted from the 1 p.m. train at Ramnagar and set off on our 24-mile foot journey to Kartkanala. Our first stage was only 7 miles, but it was evening before we arrived at Gargya. I had left home in a hurry on receiving Baines' letter, and had not had time to ask for permission to occupy the Gargya forest bungalow, so I slept out in the open. On the far side of the Kosi river at Gargya, there is a cliff several hundred feet high, and while I was trying to get sleep I heard what I thought were stones falling off the cliff on the rocks below. The sound was exactly the same as would be made by bringing 2 stones violently together. After some time this sound worried me, as sounds will on a hot night, and as the moon was up and the light good enough to avoid stepping on snakes, I left my camp bed and set out to make investigations. I found that the sound was being made by a colony of frogs in a marsh by the side of the road. I have heard land, water on tree frogs making strange sounds in different parts of the world, but I have never heard anything so strange as the sound made by the frogs at Gargya in the month of May. After a very early start next morning we did the 12 miles to Mohan before the sun got hot, and while my men were cooking their food and my servants were preparing my breakfast, the chowkidar of the bungalow, 2 forest guards, and several men from the Mohan Bazaar, entertained me with stories of the man-eater, the most recent of which concerned the exploits of a fisherman who had been fishing the Kosi river. One of the forest guards claimed to be the proud hero of this exploit, and he described very graphically how he had been out one day with the fisherman and, on turning a bend in the river, they had come face to face with the man-eater, and how the fisherman had thrown away his rod and had grabbed the rifle off his, the forest guard's, shoulder, and how they had run for their lives with the tiger close on their heels. "Did you look back?" I asked. "No, Sahib," said he, pitying my ignorance. How could a man who was running for his life from a man-eater look back? And how the fisherman, who was leading by a head, in a thick patch of grass had fallen over a sleeping bear, after which there had been great confusion and shouting, and everyone, including the bear, had run in different directions and the fisherman had got lost, and how after a long time the fisherman had eventually found his way back to the bungalow and had said a lot to him, the forest guard, on the subject of having run away with his rifle and left him empty-handed to deal with a man-eating tiger and an angry bear. The forest guard ended up his recital by saying that the fisherman had left Mohan the following day saying that he had hurt his leg when he fell over the bear, and that anyway there were no fish to be caught in the Kosi river. By midday we were ready to continue our journey, and, with many warnings from the small crowd that had collected to see us off to keep a sharp lookout for the man-eater while going through the dense forest that lay ahead of us, we set out on our 4,000-foot climb to Kartkanala. Our progress was slow, for my men were carrying heavy loads and the track was excessively steep, and the heat terrific. There had been some trouble in the upper villages a short time previously, necessitating the dispatch from Nainital of a small police force, and I had been advised to take everything I needed for myself and my men with me, as owing to the unsettled conditions it would not be possible to get any stores locally. This was the reason for the heavy loads my men were carrying. After many halts we reached the edge of the cultivated land in the late afternoon, and as there was now no further danger to be apprehended for my men from the man-eater, I left them and set out alone for the forester's hut which is visible from Mohan, and which had been pointed out to me by the forest guards as the best place for my stay while at Kartkanala. The hut is on the ridge of the high hill overlooking Mohan, and as I approached it along the level stretch of road running across the face of the hill, in turning a corner in a ravine where there is some dense undergrowth, I came on a woman filling an earthenware pitcher from a little trickle of water flowing down a wooden trough. Apprehending that my approach on rubber-soled shoes would frighten her, I coughed to attract her attention, noticed that she started violently as I did so, and a few yards beyond her, stopped to light a cigarette. A minute or two later I asked, without turning my head, if it was safe for anyone to be in this lonely spot, and after a little hesitation the woman answered that it was not safe, but that water had to be fetched, and as there was no one in the home to accompany her, she had come alone. Was there no man? Yes, there was a man, but he was in the fields ploughing, and in any case it was the duty of women to fetch water. How long would it take to fill the pitcher? Only a little longer. The woman had got over her fright and shyness, and I was now subjected to a close cross-examination. Was I a policeman? No. Was I a forest officer? No. Then who was I? Just a man. Why had I come? To try and help the people of Kartkanola. In what way? By shooting the man-eater. Where had I heard about the man-eater? Why had I come alone? Where were my men? How many were there? How long would I stay? And so on. The pitcher was not declared full until the woman had satisfied her curiosity, and as she walked behind me she pointed to one of several ridges running down the south face of the hill, and pointing out a big tree growing on a grassy slope said that 3 days previously the man-eater had killed a woman under it. This tree, I noted, with interest, was only 200 or 300 yards from my objective, the forester's hut. We had now come to a footpath running up the hill, and as she took it the woman said the village from which she had come was just round the shoulder of the hill, and added that she was now quite safe. Those of you who know the women of India will realize that I had accomplished a lot, especially when it is remembered that there had recently been trouble in this area with the police. So far from alarming the woman and thereby earning the hostility of the entire countryside, I had, by standing by while she filled her pitcher and answering a few questions, gained a friend who would in the shortest time possible acquaint the whole population of the village of my arrival, that I was not an officer of any kind, and that the sole purpose of my visit was to try to rid him of the man-eater. Chapter 3. The forester's hut was on a little knoll some 20 yards to the left of the road, and as the door was only fastened with a chain I opened it and walked inside. The room was about 10 feet square and quite clean, but had a moldy, disused smell. I learned later that the hut had not been occupied since the advent of the man-eater in that area 18 months previously. On either side of the main room, there were 2 narrow slips of rooms, one used as a kitchen, and the other as a fuel store. The hut would make a nice safe shelter for my men, and having opened the back door to let a current of air blow through the room, I went outside and selected a spot between the hut and the road for my 40-pound tent. There was no furniture of any kind in the hut, so I sat down on a rock near the road to await the arrival of my men. The ridge at this point was about 50 yards wide, and as the hut was on the south edge of the ridge, and the village on the north face of the hill, the latter was not visible from the former. I had been sitting on the rock for about 10 minutes when a head appeared over the crest from the direction of the village, followed by a second and a third. My friend the water carrier had not been slow in informing the village of my arrival. When strangers meet in India and wish to glean information on any particular subject from each other, it is customary to refrain from broaching the subject that has brought him together, whether accidentally or of set purpose, until the very last moment, and to fill up the interval by finding out everything concerning each other's domestic and private affairs, as for instance, whether married and if so the number and sex of children and their ages, if not married, why not, occupation and amount of pay, and so on. Questions that would in any other part of the world earn one a thick ear are in India, and especially in our hills, asked so artlessly and universally that no one who has lived among the people dreams of taking offense at them. In my conversation with the woman I had answered many of the set questions, and the ones of a domestic nature which it is not permissible for a woman to ask of a man were being put to me when my men arrived. They had filled a kettle at the little spring, and in an incredibly short time dry sticks were collected, a fire lit, the kettle boiled, and tea and biscuits produced. As I opened a tin of condensed milk, I heard the men asking my servants why condensed milk was being used instead of fresh milk and receiving the answer that there was no fresh milk, and further that, as it had been apprehended that owing to some previous trouble in this area no fresh milk would be available, a large supply of tinned milk had been brought. The men appeared to be very distressed on hearing this, and after a whispered conversation one of them, who I learned later was the headman of Kartkanola, addressed me and said it was an insult to them to have brought tinned milk, when all the resources of the village were at my disposal. I admitted my mistake, which I said was due to my being a stranger to that locality, and told the headman that if he had any milk to spare I would gladly purchase a small quantity for my daily requirements, but that beyond the milk, I wanted for nothing. My loads had now been unstrapped, while more men had arrived from the village, and when I told my servants where I wanted them to pitch my tent, there was a horrified exclamation from the assembled villagers. Live in a tent, indeed. Was I ignorant of the fact that there was a man-eating tiger in this area and that it used this road regularly every night? If I doubted their word, let me come and see the claw marks on the doors of the houses where the road ran through the upper end of the village. Moreover, if the tiger did not eat me in the tent, it would certainly eat my men in the hut, if I was not there to protect them. This last statement made my men prick up their ears and add their entreaties to the advice of the villagers, so eventually I agreed to stay in the main room, while my 2 servants occupied the kitchen, and the 6 Garwalis the fuel store. The subject of the man-eater having been introduced, it was now possible for me to pursue it without admitting that it was the one object I had wished to introduce from the moment the first man had put his head over the ridge. The path leading down to the tree where the tiger had claimed its last victim was pointed out to me, and the time of day, and the circumstances under which the woman had been killed, explained. The road along which the tiger came every night, I was informed, ran eastward to Baital Ghat with a branch down to Mohan, and westward to Chaknakal on the Ramganga River. The road going west, after running through the upper part of the village and through cultivated land for half a mile, turned south along the face of the hill, and on rejoining the ridge on why the hut was, followed the ridge right down to Chaknakal. This portion of the road between Kartkanola and Chaknakal, some 6 miles long, was considered to be very dangerous, and had not been used since the advent of the man-eater. I subsequently found that after leaving the cultivated land the road entered dense tree and scrub jungle, which extended right down to the river. The main cultivation of Kartkanola village is on the north face of the hill, and beyond this cultivated land there are several small ridges with deep ravines between. On the nearest of these ridges, and distant about 1,000 yards from the forester's hut, there is a big pine tree. Near this tree, some 10 days previously, the tiger had killed, partly eaten and left, a woman, and as the 3 sportsmen who were staying in a forest bungalow 4 miles away were unable to climb the pine tree, the villagers had put up 3 makans in 3 separate trees, at distances varying from 100 to 150 yards from the kill, and the makans had been occupied by the sportsmen and their servants a little before sunset. There was a young moon at the time, and after it had set the villagers heard a number of shots being fired, and when they questioned the servants next morning the servants said they did not know what had been fired at, for they themselves had not seen anything. 2 days later a cow had been killed over which the sportsmen had sat, and again, as on the previous occasion, shots had been fired after the moon had set. It is these admittedly sporting but unsuccessful attempts to bag man-eaters that makes them so wary, and the more difficult to shoot the longer they live. The villagers gave me one very interesting item of news in connection with the tiger. They said they always knew when it had come into the village by the low moaning sound it made. On questioning him closely I learned that at times the sound was continuous as the tiger passed between the houses, while at other times the sound stopped for sometimes short, and other times long periods. From this information I concluded, A. that the tiger was suffering from a wound, B. that the wound was of such a nature that the tiger only felt it when in motion, and that therefore, C. the wound was in one of its legs. I was assured that the tiger had not been wounded by any local shikari, or by any of the sportsmen from Ranikhet who had sat up for it. However, this was of little importance, for the tiger had been a man-eater for years, and the wound that I believed it was suffering from might have been the original cause of its becoming a man-eater. A very interesting point, and one that could only be cleared up by examining the tiger, after it was dead. The men were curious to know why I was so interested in the sound made by the tiger, and when I told them that it indicated the animal had a wound in one of its legs and that the wound had been caused either by a bullet, or porcupine quills, they disagreed with my reasoning and said that on the occasions they had seen the tiger it appeared to be in sound condition, and further, that the ease with which it killed and carried off its victims was proof that it was not crippled in any way. However, what I told them was remembered and later earned me the reputation of being gifted with second sight. Chapter 4. When passing through Ramnagar I had asked the Tahsildar to purchase 2 young male buffaloes for me and to send him to Mohan, where my men would take him over. I told the villagers I intended tying up one of the buffaloes near the tree where 3 days previously the woman had been killed and the other on the road to Chaknakel, and they said they could think of no better sites, but that they would talk the matter over among themselves, and let me know in the morning if they had any other suggestions to make. Night was now drawing in, and before leaving the headman promised to send word to all the adjoining villages in the morning to let them know of my arrival, the reason for my coming, and to impress on them the urgency of letting me know without loss of time of any kills or attacks by the tiger in their areas. The musty smell in the room had much decreased, though it was still noticeable. However, I paid no attention to it, and after a bath and dinner put 2 stones against the doors, there being no other way of keeping them shut, and being bone tired after my day's exertions went to bed and to sleep. I am a light sleeper, and 2 or 3 hours later I awoke on hearing an animal moving about in the jungle. It came right up to the back door. Getting hold of a rifle and a torch, I moved the stone aside with my foot and heard an animal moving off as I opened the door. It might from the sound it was making have been the tiger, but it might also have been a leopard or a porcupine. However, the jungle was too thick for me to see what it was. Back in the room and with the stone once more in position, I noticed I had developed a sore throat, which I attributed to having sat in the wind after the hot walk up from Mohan. But when my servant pushed the door open and brought in my early morning cup of tea, I found I was suffering from an attack of laryngitis, due possibly to my having slept in a long disused hut, the roof of which was swarming with bats. My servant informed me that he and his companion had escaped infection, but that the 6 Gawalis in the fuel store were all suffering from the same complaint as I was. My stock of medicine consisted of a 2-ounce bottle of iodine and a few tablets of quinine, and on rummaging in my gun case I found a small paper packet of permanganate which my sister had provided for me on a previous occasion. The packet was soaked through with gun oil, but the crystals were still soluble, and I put a liberal quantity of the crystals into a tin of hot water, together with some iodine. The resulting gargle was very potent, and while it blackened our teeth it did much to relieve the soreness in our throats. After an early breakfast I sent 4 men down to Mohan to bring up the 2 buffaloes, and myself set off to prospect the ground where the woman had been killed. From the directions I had received overnight, I had no difficulty in finding the spot where the tiger had attacked and killed the woman, as she was tying the grass she had cut into a bundle. The grass, and the rope she was using, were lying just as they had been left, as were also 2 bundles of grass left by her companions when they had run off in fright to the village. The men had told me that the body of the woman had not been found, but from the fact that 3 perfectly good lengths of rope and the dead woman's sickle had been left in the jungle, I am inclined to think that no attempt had been made to find her. The woman had been killed at the upper end of a small landslide, and the tiger had taken her down the slide and into a thick patch of undergrowth. Here the tiger had waited, possibly to give the 2 women time to get out of sight, and had then crossed the ridge visible from the hut, after which it had gone with its kill straight down the hill for a mile or more into dense tree and scrub jungle. The tracks were now 4 days old, and as there was nothing to be gained by following them further, I turned back to the hut. The climb back to the ridge was a very steep one, and when I reached the hut at about midday I found an array of pots and pans of various shapes and sizes on the veranda, all containing milk. In contrast to the famine of the day before, there was now abundance, sufficient milk in fact for me to have bathed in. My servants informed me they had protested to no effect, and that each man had said, as he deposited his vessel on the veranda, that he would take good care that I used no more condensed milk while I remained in their midst. I did not expect the men to return from Mohan with the buffaloes before nightfall, so after lunch I set out to have a look at the road to Chaknakel. From the hut the hill sloped gradually upwards to a height of about 500 feet, and was roughly triangular in shape. The road, after running through cultivated land for half a mile, turned sharply to the left, went across a steep rocky hill until it regained the ridge, and then turned to the right and followed the ridge down to Chaknakel. The road was level for a short distance after coming out on the ridge, and then went steeply down, the gradient in places being eased by hairpin bends. I had the whole afternoon before me, and examined about 3 miles of the road very carefully. When a tiger uses a road regularly, it invariably leaves signs of its passage by making scratch marks on the side of the road. These scratch marks, made for the same purpose as similar marks made by domestic cats and all other members of the cat family, are of very great interest to the sportsman, for they provide him with the following very useful information, 1. Whether the animal that has made the mark is a male or a female. 2. The direction in which it was traveling. 3. The length of time that has elapsed since it passed. 4. The direction and approximate distance of its headquarters. 5. The nature of its kills. And finally, 6. Whether the animal has recently had a meal of human flesh. The value of this easily acquired information to one who is hunting a man-eater on strange ground will be easily understood. Tigers leave their pug marks on the roads they use, and these pug marks can provide one with quite a lot of useful information, as for instance the direction and speed at which the animal was traveling, its sex and age, whether all 4 limbs are sound, and if not sound, which particular limb is defective. The road I was on had through long disuse got overgrown with short stiff grass and was therefore not, except in 1 or 2 damp places, a good medium on which to leave pug marks. One of these damp places was within a few yards of where the road came out on the ridge, and just below this spot there was a green and very stagnant pool of water, a regular drinking place for samba. I found several scratch marks just round the corner where the road turned to the left after leaving the cultivated ground, the most recent of which was 3 days old. 200 yards from these scratch marks the road, for a third of its width, ran under an overhanging rock. This rock was 10 feet high, and at the top of it there was a flat piece of ground 2 or 3 yards wide, which was only visible from the road when approaching the rock from the village side. On the ridge I found more scratch marks, but I did not find any pug marks until I got to the first hairpin bend. Here, in cutting across the bend, the tiger had left its tracks where it had jumped down onto some soft earth. The tracks, which were a day old, were a little distorted, but even so it was possible to see that they had been made by a big, old, male tiger. When one is moving in an area in which a man-eating tiger is operating, progress is of necessity very slow, for every obstruction in one's line of walk, be it a bush, a tree, rock, or an inequality in the ground capable of concealing death, has to be cautiously approached, while at the same time, if a wind is not blowing, and there was no wind that evening, a careful and constant lookout has to be maintained behind and on either side. Further, there was much of interest to be looked at, for it was the month of May, when orchids at this elevation, 4,000 to 5,000 feet, are at their best, and I have never seen a greater variety or a greater wealth of bloom than the forests on that hill had to show. The beautiful white butterfly orchid was in greatest profusion, and every second tree of any size appeared to have decked itself out with them. It was here that I first saw a bird that Prater of the Bombay Natural History Society later very kindly identified for me as the mountain crag martin, a bird of a uniform ash color, with a slight tinge of pink on its breast, and in size a little smaller than a rosy pastor. These birds had their broods with them, and while the young ones, 4 to a brood, sat in a row on a dry twig at the top of a high tree, the parent birds kept darting away, often to a distance of 200 or 300 yards, to catch insects. The speed at which they flew was amazing, and I am quite sure there is nothing in feathers in North India, not excluding our winter visitor the great Tibetan swallow, that these martins could not make rings round. Another thing about these birds that was very interesting was their wonderful eyesight. On occasions they would fly in a dead straight line for several hundred yards before turning and coming back. It was not possible, at the speed they were going, that they were chasing insects on these long flights, and as after each flight the bird invariably thrust some minute object into one of the gaping mouths, I believe they were able to see insects at a range at which they would not have been visible to the human eye through the most powerful field glasses. Safeguarding my neck, looking out for tracks, enjoying nature generally, and listening to all the jungle sounds, a samba a mile away down the hillside in the direction of Mohan was warning the jungle folk of the presence of a tiger, and the kaka and the langur, Entelis monkey, on the road to Chaknakal were warning other jungle folk of the presence of a leopard. Time passed quickly, and I found myself back at the overhanging rock as the sun was setting. As I approached this rock I marked it as being quite the most dangerous spot in all the ground I had so far gone over. A tiger lying on the grass-covered bit of ground above the rock would only have to wait until anyone going either up or down the road was under or had passed it to have them at his mercy. A very dangerous spot indeed, and one that needed remembering. When I got back to the hut I found the 2 buffaloes had arrived, but it was too late to do anything with them that evening. My servants had kept a fire going most of the day in the hut, the air of which was now sweet and clean, but even so I was not going to risk sleeping in a closed room again, so I made them cut 2 thorn bushes and wedge them firmly into the doorways before going to bed. There was no movement in the jungle near the back door that night, and after a sound sleep I woke in the morning with my throat very much better. I spent most of the morning talking to the village people and listening to the tales they had to tell of the man-eater and the attempts that had been made to shoot it, and after lunch I tied up one buffalo on the small ridge the tiger had crossed when carrying away the woman, and the other at the hairpin bed where I had seen the pug marks. Next morning I found both buffaloes sleeping peacefully after having eaten most of the big feed of grass I had provided them with. I had tied bells round the necks of both animals, and the absence of any sound from these bells as I approached each buffalo gave me 2 disappointments, for, as I have said, I found both of them asleep. That evening I changed the position of the second buffalo from the hairpin bend to where the road came out on the ridge, close to the pool of stagnant water. The methods most generally employed in tiger shooting can briefly be described as A. Sitting up, and B. Beating, and young male buffaloes are used as bait in both cases. The procedure followed is to select the area most convenient for a sit-up, or for a beat, and to tie the bait out in the late evening using a rope which the bait cannot, but which the tiger can break, and when the bait is taken to either sit up over the kill on a macan in a tree, or beat the cover into which the kill has been taken. In the present case neither of these methods was feasible. My throat, though very much better, was still sore, and it would not have been possible for me to have sat up for any length of time without coughing, and a beat over that vast area of heavily wooded and broken ground would have been hopeless even if I had been able to muster 1,000 men, so I decided to stalk the tiger, and to this end carefully sighted my 2 buffaloes and tied him to stout saplings with 4 1-inch thick hemp ropes, and left him out in the jungle for the whole 24 hours. I now stalked the buffaloes in turn each morning as soon as there was sufficient light to shoot by, and again in the evening, for tigers, be they man-eaters or not, kill as readily in the day as they do at night in areas in which they are not disturbed, and during the day, while I waited for news from outlying villages, nursed my throat, and rested, my 6 gawalis fed and watered the buffaloes. On the 4th evening, when I was returning at sunset after visiting the buffalo on the ridge, as I came round a bend in the road 30 yards from the overhanging rock, I suddenly, and for the first time since my arrival at Kartkanola, felt I was in danger, and that the danger that threatened me was on the rock in front of me. For 5 minutes I stood perfectly still with my eyes fixed on the upper edge of the rock, watching for movement. At that short range the flicker of an eyelid would have caught my eyes, but there was not even this small movement, and after going forward 10 paces, I again stood watching for several minutes. The fact that I had seen no movement did not in any way reassure me. The man-eater was on the rock, of that I was sure, and the question was, what was I going to do about it? The hill, as I have already told you, was very steep, had great rocks jutting out of it, and was overgrown with long grass and tree and scrub jungle. Bad as the going was, had it been earlier in the day I would have gone back and worked round and above the tiger to try to get a shot at him, but with only half an hour of daylight left, and the best part of a mile still to go, it would have been madness to have left the road. So, slipping out the safety catch and putting the rifle to my shoulder, I started to pass the rock. The road here was about 8 feet wide, and going to the extreme outer edge I started walking crab fashion, feeling each step with my feet before putting my weight down to keep from stepping off into space. Progress was slow and difficult, but as I drew level with the overhanging rock and then began to pass it, hope rose high that the tiger would remain where he was until I reached that part of the road from which the flat bit of ground above the rock, on which he was lying, was visible. The tiger, however, having failed to catch me off my guard, was taking no chances, and I had just got clear of the rock when I heard a low muttered growl above me, and a little later first a kaka went off barking to the right, and then 2 hind samba started belling near the crest of the triangular hill. The tiger had got away with a sound skin, but for the matter of that, so had I, so there was no occasion for regrets, and from the place on the hill where the samba said he was, I felt sure he would hear the bell I had hung round the neck of the buffalo that was tied on the ridge near the stagnant pool. When I reached the cultivated land I found a group of men waiting for me. They had heard the kaka and samba and were very disappointed that I had not seen the tiger, but cheered up when I told them I had great hopes for the morrow. Chapter 5. During the night a dust storm came on, followed by heavy rain, and I found to my discomfort that the roof of the hut was very porous. However, I eventually found a spot where it was leaking less than in others, dragged my camp bed to it and continued my sleep. It was a brilliantly clear morning when I awoke. The rain had washed the heat haze and dust out of the atmosphere, and every leaf and blade of grass was glistering in the newly risen sun. Hitherto I had visited the nearer buffalo first, but this morning I had an urge to reverse the daily procedure, and after instructing my men to wait until the sun was well up and then go to feed and water the nearer buffalo, I set off with high hopes down the Chaknakal road, having first cleaned and oiled my 454 rifle, a very efficient weapon, and a good and faithful friend of many years' standing. The overhanging rock that I passed with such trouble the previous evening did not give me a moment's uneasiness now, and after passing it I started looking for tracks, for the rain had softened the surface of the road. I saw nothing however until I came to the damp place on the road, which, as I have said, was on the near side of the ridge and close to the pool where the buffalo was tied. Here in the soft earth I found the pug marks of the tiger, made before the storm had come on, and going in the direction of the ridge. Close to this spot there is a rock about 3 feet high, on the Khud side of the road. On the previous occasions that I had stalked down the road I had found that by standing on this rock I could look over a hump in the road and see the buffalo where it was tied 40 yards away. When I now climbed onto the rock and slowly raised my head, I found that the buffalo had gone. This discovery was as disconcerting as it was inexplicable. To prevent the tiger from carrying the buffalo away to some distant part of the jungle, where the only method of getting a shot would have been by sitting up on the ground or in a tree, a hopeless proceeding with my throat in the condition it was in, I had used 4 thicknesses of strong 1-inch thick hemp rope, and even so the tiger had got away with the kill. I was wearing the thinnest of rubber-soled shoes, and very silently I approached the sapling to which the buffalo had been tied and examined the ground. The buffalo had been killed before the storm, but had been carried away after the rain had stopped, without any portion of it having been eaten. 3 of the ropes I had twisted together had been gnawed through, and the 4th had been broken. Tigers do not usually gnaw through ropes. However, this one had done so, and had carried off the kill down the hill facing Mohan. My plans had been badly upset, but very fortunately the rain had come to my assistance. The thick carpet of dead leaves which the day before had been as dry as tinder were now wet and pliable, and provided I made no mistakes, the pains the tiger had been to in getting away with the kill might yet prove his undoing. When entering a jungle in which rapid shooting might at any moment become necessary, I never feel happy until I have reassured myself that my rifle is loaded. To pull a trigger in an emergency and wake up in the happy hunting grounds, or elsewhere, because one had omitted to load a weapon, would be one of those acts of carelessness for which no excuse could be found. So though I knew I had loaded my rifle before I came to the overhanging rock, I now opened it and extracted the cartridges. I changed one that was discolored and dented, and after moving the safety catch up and down several times to make sure it was working smoothly, I have never carried a cocked weapon, I set off to follow the drag. This word, drag, when it is used to describe the mark left on the ground by a tiger when it is moving its kill from one place to another, is misleading, for a tiger when taking its kill any distance. I have seen a tiger carry a full-grown cow for 4 miles, does not drag it, it carries it, and if the kill is too heavy to be carried, it is left. The drag is distinct or faint according to the size of the animal that is being carried, and the manner in which it is being held. For instance, assuming the kill is a samba and the tiger is holding it by the neck, the hindquarters will trail on the ground leaving a distinct drag mark. On the other hand, if the samba is being held by the middle of the back, there may be a faint drag mark, or there may be none at all. In the present case, the tiger was carrying the buffalo by the neck, and the hindquarters trailing on the ground were leaving a drag mark it was easy to follow. For 100 yards the tiger went diagonally across the face of the hill until he came to a steep clay bank. In attempting to cross this bank he had slipped and relinquished his hold of the kill, which had rolled down the hill for 30 or 40 yards until it had fetched up against a tree. On recovering the kill the tiger picked it up by the back, and from now on only one leg occasionally touched the ground, leaving a faint drag mark, which nevertheless, owing to the hillside being carpeted with bracken, was not very difficult to follow. In his fall the tiger had lost direction, and he now appeared to be undecided where to take the kill. First he went a couple of 100 yards to the right, then 100 yards straight down the hill through a dense patch of ringles, stunted bamboo. After forcing his way with considerable difficulty through the ringles, he turned to the left and went diagonally across the hill for a few hundred yards until he came to a great rock, to the right of which he skirted. This rock was flush with the ground on the approach side, and, rising gently for 20 feet, appeared to project out over a hollow or dell of considerable extent. If there was a cave or recess under the projection, it would be a very likely place for the tiger to have taken his kill to, so leaving the drag I stepped onto the rock and moved forward very slowly, examining every yard of ground below, and on either side of me, as it came into view. On reaching the end of the projection and looking over, I was disappointed to find that the hill came up steeply to meet the rock, and that there was no cave or recess under it as I had expected there would be. As the point of the rock offered a good view of the dell and of the surrounding jungle, and was comparatively safe from an attack from the man-eater, I sat down, and as I did so, I caught sight of a red and white object in a dense patch of short undergrowth, 40 or 50 yards directly below me. When one is looking for a tiger in heavy jungle, everything red that catches the eye is immediately taken for the tiger, and here, not only could I see the red of the tiger, but I could also see his stripes. For a long minute I watched the object intently, and then, as the face you are told to look for in a freak picture suddenly resolves itself, I saw that the object I was looking at was the kill, and not the tiger. The red was blood where he had recently been eating, and the stripes were the ribs from which he had torn away the skin. I was thankful for having held my fire for that long minute, for in a somewhat similar case a friend of mine ruined his chance of bagging a very fine tiger by putting 2 bullets into a kill over which he had intended sitting. Fortunately he was a good shot, and the 2 men whom he had sent out in advance to find the kill and put up a mackin over it, and who were, at the time he fired, standing near the kill screened by a bush, escaped injury. When a tiger that has not been disturbed leaves his kill out in the open, it can be assumed that he is lying up close at hand to guard the kill from vultures and other scavengers, and the fact that I could not see the tiger did not mean that he was not lying somewhere close by in the dense undergrowth. Tigers are troubled by flies and do not lie long in one position, so I decided to remain where I was and watch for movement. But hardly had I come to this decision, when I felt an irritation in my throat. I had not quite recovered from my attack of laryngitis, and the irritation grew rapidly worse until it became imperative for me to cough. The usual methods one employs on these occasions, whether in church or the jungle, such as holding the breath and swallowing hard, gave no relief until it became a case of cough, or burst, and in desperation I tried to relieve my throat by giving the alarm call of the langur. Sounds are difficult to translate into words, and for those of you who are not acquainted with our jungles, I would try to describe this alarm call, which can be heard for half a mile, as cock, 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 repeated again and again at short intervals, and ending up with kokora. All langurs do not call at tigers, but the ones in our hills certainly do, and as this tiger had probably heard the call every day of his life, it was the one sound I could make to which he would not pay the slightest attention. My rendering of the call in this emergency did not sound very convincing, but it had the desired effect of removing the irritation from my throat. For half an hour thereafter I continued to sit on the rock, watching for movement and listening for news from the jungle folk, and when I had satisfied myself that the tiger was not anywhere within my range of vision, I got off the rock, and, moving with the utmost caution, went down to the kill. Chapter 6. I regret I am not able to tell you what weight of flesh a full-grown tiger can consume at a meal, but you will have some idea of his capacity when I tell you he can eat a samba in 2 days, and a buffalo in 3, leaving possibly a small snack for the 4th day. The buffalo I had tied up was not full-grown, but he was by no means a small animal, and the tiger had eaten approximately half of him. With a meal of that dimension inside of him, I felt sure he had not gone far, and as the ground was still wet, and would remain so for another hour or 2, I decided to find out in what direction he had gone, and if possible, stalk him. There was a confusion of tracks near the kill, but by going round in widening circles, I found the track the tiger had made when leaving. Soft-footed animals are a little more difficult to track than hard-footed ones, yet after long years of experience, tracking needs as little effort as a gun dog exerts when following a scent. As silently and as slowly as a shadow I took up the track, knowing that the tiger would be close at hand. When I had gone 100 yards, I came on a flat bit of ground, 20 feet square, and carpeted with that variety of short soft grass that has highly scented roots. On this grass the tiger had lain, the imprint of his body being clearly visible. As I was looking at the imprint and guessing at the size of the animal that had made it, I saw some of the blades of grass that had been crushed down, spring erect. This indicated that the tiger had been gone only a minute or so. You will have some idea of the layout when I tell you that the tiger had brought the kill down from the north, and on leaving it had gone west, and that the rock on which I had sat, the kill, and the spot where I was now standing, formed the points of a triangle, one side of which was 40 yards, and the other two sides 100 yards long. My first thought on seeing the grass spring erect was that the tiger had seen me and moved off, but this I soon found was not likely, for neither the rock nor the kill was visible from the grass plot, and that he had not seen me and moved after I had taken up his track I was quite certain. Why then had he left his comfortable bed and gone away? The sun shining on the back of my neck provided the answer. It was now 9 o'clock of an unpleasantly hot May morning, and a glance at the sun and the tree tops over which it had come showed that it had been shining on the grass for 10 minutes. The tiger had evidently found it too hot, and gone away a few minutes before my arrival to look for a shady spot. I have told you that the grass plot was 20 feet square. On the far side to that from which I had approached there was a fallen tree, lying north and south. This tree was about 4 feet in diameter, and as it was lying along the edge of the grass plot in the middle of which I was standing, it was 10 feet away from me. The root end of the tree was resting on the hillside, which here went up steeply and was overgrown with brushwood, and the branch end, which had been snapped off when the tree had fallen, was projecting out over the hillside. Beyond the tree the hill appeared to be more or less perpendicular, and running across the face of it was a narrow ledge of rock, which disappeared into dense jungle 30 yards further on. If my surmise, that the sun had been the cause of the tiger changing his position, was correct, there was no more suitable place than the lee of the tree for him to have taken shelter in, and the only way of satisfying myself on this point was to walk up to the tree and look over. Here a picture seen long years ago in Punch flashed into memory. The picture was of a lone sportsman who had gone out to hunt lions and who, on glancing up onto the rock he was passing, looked straight into the grinning face of the most enormous lion in Africa. Underneath the picture was written, "When you go out looking for a lion, be quite sure that you want to see him." True, there would be this small difference, that whereas my friend in Africa looked up into the lion's face, I would look down into the tiger's. Otherwise the two cases, assuming that the tiger was on the far side of the tree, would be very similar. Slipping my feet forward an inch at a time on the soft grass, I now started to approach the tree, and had covered about half the distance that separated me from it when I caught sight of a black and yellow object about 3 inches long on the rocky ledge, which I now saw was a well-used game path. For a long minute I stared at this motionless object, until I was convinced that it was the tip of the tiger's tail. If the tail was pointing away from me, the head must obviously be towards me, and as the ledge was only some 2 feet wide, the tiger could only be crouching down and waiting to spring the moment my head appeared over the bole of the tree. The tip of the tail was 20 feet from me, and allowing 8 feet for the tiger's length while crouching, his head would be 12 feet away. But I should have to approach much nearer before I should be able to see enough of his body to get in a crippling shot, and a crippling shot it would have to be if I wanted to leave on my feet. And now, for the first time in my life, I regretted my habit of carrying an uncocked rifle. The safety catch of my 454 makes a very distinct click when thrown off, and to make any sound now would either bring the tiger right on top of me, or send him straight down the steep hillside without any possibility of my getting in a shot. Inch by inch I again started to creep forward, until the whole of the tail, and after it the hindquarters, came into view. When I saw the hindquarters, I could have shouted with delight, for they showed that the tiger was not crouching and ready to spring, but was lying down. As there was only room for his body on the 2-foot wide ledge, he had stretched his hind legs out and was resting them on the upper branches of an oak sapling growing up the face of the almost perpendicular hillside. Another foot forward and his belly came into view, and from the regular way in which it was heaving up and down I knew that he was asleep. Less slowly now I moved forward, until his shoulder, and then his whole length, was exposed to my view. The back of his head was resting on the edge of the grass plot, which extended for 3 or 4 feet beyond the fallen tree. His eyes were fast shut, and his nose was pointing to heaven. Aligning the sights of the rifle on his forehead, I pressed the trigger and, while maintaining a steady pressure on it, pushed up the safety catch. I had no idea how this reversal of the usual method of discharging a rifle would work, But it did work. And when the heavy bullet at that short range crashed into his forehead, not so much as a quiver went through his body. His tail remained stretched straight out, his hind legs continued to rest on the upper branches of the sapling, and his nose still pointed to heaven. Nor did his position change in the slightest when I sent a second, and quite unnecessary, bullet to follow the first. The only change noticeable was that his stomach had stopped heaving up and down, and that blood was trickling down his forehead from two surprisingly small holes. I do not know how the close proximity of a tiger reacts on others, but me it always leaves with a breathless feeling, due possibly as much to fear as to excitement, and a desire for a little rest. I sat down on the fallen tree and lit the cigarette I had denied myself from the day my throat had got bad, and allowed my thoughts to wander. Any task well accomplished gives satisfaction, and the one just completed was no exception. The reason for my presence at that spot was the destruction of the man-eater, and from the time I had left the road 2 hours previously right up to the moment I pushed up the safety catch, everything, including the langur call, had worked smoothly and without a single fault. In this there was great satisfaction, the kind of satisfaction I imagine an author must feel when he writes finis to the plot that, stage by stage, has unfolded itself just as he desired it to. In my case, however, the finish had not been satisfactory, for I had killed the animal that was lying 5 feet from me, in his sleep. My personal feelings in the matter are, I know, of little interest to others, but it occurs to me that possibly you also might think it was not cricket, and in that case I should like to put the arguments before you that I used on myself, in the hope that you will find them more satisfactory than I did. These arguments were: A. The tiger was a man-eater that was better dead than alive. B. Therefore it made no difference whether he was awake or asleep when killed. And C. That had I walked away when I saw his belly heaving up and down, I should have been morally responsible for the deaths of all the human beings he killed thereafter. All good and sound arguments, you will admit, for my having acted as I did, but the regret remains that through fear of the consequences to myself, or fear of losing the only chance I might ever get, or possibly a combination of the two, I did not awaken the sleeping animal and give him a sporting chance. The tiger was dead, and if my trophy was to be saved from falling into the valley below and ruined, it was advisable to get him off the ledge with as little delay as possible. Leaning the rifle, for which I had no further use, against the fallen tree, I climbed up to the road and, once round the corner near the cultivated land, I cupped my hands and sent a cooee echoing over the hills and valleys. I had no occasion to repeat the call, for my men had heard my 2 shots when returning from attending to the first buffalo and had run back to the hut to collect as many villages as were within calling distance. Now, on hearing my cooee, the whole crowd came helter-skelter down the road to meet me. When stout ropes and an axe had been procured, I took the crowd back with me, and after I had secured the ropes round the tiger, willing hands half carried and half dragged him off the ledge and over the fallen tree, onto the plot of grass. Here I would have skinned him, but the villagers begged me not to do so, saying that the women and children of Kartkanola and the adjoining villages would be very disappointed if they were not given an opportunity of seeing the tiger with their own eyes and satisfying themselves that the man-eater, in fear of whom they had lived for so many years, and who had established a reign of terror over the whole district, was really and truly dead. While a couple of saplings to assist in carrying the tiger back to the hut were being felled, I saw some of the men passing their hands over the tiger's limbs, and knew they were satisfying themselves that their assertion that the tiger had not been suffering from any old, or crippling, wounds was correct. At the hut, the tiger was placed in the shade of a wide-spreading tree, and the villagers informed that it was at their disposal up to 2 o'clock. Longer I could not give them, for it was a very hot day and there was fear of the hair slipping, and the skin being ruined. I myself had not looked closely at the tiger, but at 2 p.m., when I laid him on his back to start the skinning, I noticed that most of the hair from the inner side of his left foreleg was missing, and that there were a number of small punctures in the skin, from which yellow fluid was exuding. I did not draw attention to these punctures, and left the skinning of the leg, which was considerably thinner than the right leg, to the last. When the skin had been removed from the rest of the animal, I made a long cut from the chest to the pad of the festering left leg, and as I removed the skin, drew out of the flesh, one after another, porcupine quills which the men standing round eagerly seized as souvenirs. The longest of these quills was about 5 inches, and the total number was between 25 and 30. The flesh under the skin, from the tiger's chest to the pad of his foot, was soapy, and of a dark yellow color, cause enough to have made the poor beast moan when he walked, and quite sufficient reason for his having become, and having remained, a man-eater, for porcupine quills do not dissolve no matter how long they are embedded in flesh. I have extracted, possibly, a couple of hundred porcupine quills from the man-eating tigers I have shot. Many of these quills have been over 9 inches in length and as thick as pencils. The majority were embedded in hard muscles, a few were wedged firmly between bones, and all were broken off short under the skin. Unquestionably the tigers acquired the quills when killing porcupines for food, but the question arises, to which I regret I am unable to give any satisfactory answer, why animals with the intelligence and the agility of tigers should have been so careless as to drive quills deep into themselves, or be so slow in their movements as to permit porcupines, whose only method of defending themselves is by walking backwards, to do so, and further, why the quills should have been broken off short. For porcupine quills are not brittle. Leopards are just as partial to porcupines as our hill tigers are, but they do not get quills stuck in them, for they kill porcupines, as I have seen, by catching them by the head, and why tigers do not employ the same safe and obvious method of killing as leopards employ, and so avoid injury to themselves is a mystery to me.